When it comes to a movie like Eddington, all nuance is thrown out the window because with Ari Aster's new film, you are either going to have a visceral reaction positively or negatively. This is a movie that is divisive by nature, and it's by the very design of this movie because this movie is about division. So you're either going to love what this movie stands for and really appreciate the vision, even if you have some qualms with it, or you are going to detest what this movie stands for and everything that it is about. And the brilliance of Ari Aster is that all four of his films are designed to elicit divisive responses. He is not somebody that makes crowd pleasers, so much so that his two most commercially successful films that probably most people that are film fans seemingly seem to love are Hereditary and Midsommar, which are two legitimately demented horror films. So Eddington is going to piss off a lot of people due to its inherent political nature. Make no mistake, this movie is politically charged, just maybe not the way you may think so. I have a feeling a lot of people are walking out of Eddington and maybe they find this review or they're seeing other people's reviews and all they're trying to get out of their brain is, what the did I just watch? That is kind of the perfect response to watching Eddington. If this movie made full sense the first time around, it would be a failure. I had the same reaction walking out of Eddington, and it's now been close to 24 hours later, and I want to explore some of the political thorniness of setting a story in the summer of 2020 and the challenges and I think success that comes out of this. And first we should talk about how to approach a movie like Eddington, because this is not a movie that I would suggest you going into to have your political worldview be affirmed. This is neither a liberal movie. This is neither a conservative movie. I don't think it has that framing devices. Yes, liberalism and conservatism is fundamental to understanding this movie, but it is not what defines this movie. And there is also this question that comes into diving into Eddington, which is this movie too soon? And I think that's a huge topic of conversation worth exploring today. And I've heard some people say and suggest that maybe we should wait a bit longer. There isn't enough distance. Fundamentally, I think that's wrong because I think fundamentally it's a different movie if you do this. There is something about an instant reaction versus having distance and clarity of mind. This movie is trying to reflect on a very specific moment in time as it's happening. Ari Aster started writing this movie in June of 2020. So it is quite literally reactionary, and it's so focused in on that mindset. I think if you give distance to this movie 20 to 30 years later, I don't know if this movie looks, sounds, and acts the same way. And maybe some people would say that to a benefit. I think there is an honesty that comes through with this movie being set just a few years after 2020. And everything that goes into this, we are going to bring our political baggage into this movie. It is impossible to avoid. I would really suggest trying to check as much of that out at the door when you get there, because this movie isn't necessarily about this. Instead, it's focused on what happened, how it happened, why it happened, and what it does to people. So let's dive into Eddington. But before we do that, if you're watching this, please subscribe. And I also hope you follow me on TikTok and Instagram at Ben Talks Films. If you follow me on Instagram, message me letting me know you're coming from this video. I have a Superman digital collection code. I own all these movies digitally, so I'm trying to get rid of this code. Just message me. Back to the film of Eddington. This movie is set in Eddington, New Mexico, the summer of 2020. As a recap for anyone who needs this, this is set during the backdrop of COVID-19 mandates, the George Floyd / Black Lives Matter protest in that summer. And in this film, we have the character of Sheriff Joe Cross, played by Joaquin Phoenix, who decides to run for mayor against Ted Garcia. A24 sent me these flyers. So we have right here, this is Joaquin Phoenix. Let's fix each other's hearts. You want to live in San Francisco? I didn't think so. Vote for Joe Cross. And then we have Garcia for mayor, Pedro Pascal. paving the way for a tech-positive future. And then on the back, and let me just read this real quick. Paving the way for a tech-positive future, leaders make the tough decision. That's why Ted Garcia is already in office. Don't vote him out. Make the easy decision. Re-elect Ted Garcia. And then Ted's leadership pillars and results in bullet point. And the reason I want to talk about this is because this movie is about two people not listening to each other. And that's the divide we're talking about that you can very clearly see in this photo. The distance between people at a time where distance is so key to our understanding of America. This explores the thematic terrain of the modern American West. This, in many ways, modernizes the iconography that we've seen for hundreds of years of the American West, but now puts it in the age of social media. Eddington is a town that was once isolated, and now it's fully plugged in like the rest of the country due to social media and screens. And it reflects how a small town becomes the epicenter of a national discourse, which is ends up what happens with Eddington. And this movie is playing with the myth of the cowboy-led town that has collapsed and what that means and what that looks like in today's age. And with that, there's also this political and cultural disconnect that comes with a town like Eddington. Because yes, while they're seeing everything that America is dealing with, they also have different points of view, and specifically their way of life is just different than someone in New York, in someone in LA. This film mentions COVID-19, it mentions lockdowns, and it definitely talks about the culture war and uses that smartly. But this movie is very careful to name drop Donald Trump. I think the subtext is very clear in this movie. And this movie is definitely MAGA coded, QAnon coded, conspiracy culture is all like at the center of this movie. But it's very careful to utilize the Trump name. It doesn't want to give Trump or conservatives credits for this extremism. I think it is more saying that they are the exploiters, but they are not the sole creators. And personally, this does disagree with my general viewpoint on this. I do think Trump is more responsible than the film is willing to admit. The movie doesn't talk about the fact that Trump is someone who really made mass political. Rather, what Eddington is trying to more explore, and I think why it is so rewarding, is it's a movie concerned about the screens and the way we consume, not specifically about our leaders. Our leaders kind of come and go, as we see in our two focal points in Ted Garcia and Joe Cross. So what we're instead focused on is how we communicate and how we understand ourselves in the age of online. There are core thematic ideas within Eddington, and they all revolve around the screen dominating everything. It dictates what we watch. It dictates what we see. It dictates when we see it and how we communicate with each other. Ari Aster, who is someone who is very open to admit that in the summer of 2020, he is very online and very plugged into Twitter culture. And he seems to believe that phones and social media have made us narcissistic. We are losing our ability to think freely, and we're addicted to broadcasting ourselves instead of connecting. That is something that is very key for the Joe Cross character, who is somebody who becomes a consumer to becomes a digital creator. And every character in this film, in one way or the other, interacts with a screen and has a very specific parasocial relationship with a screen, except for the notable example of a character named Lodge, a homeless man who is the first character we see in Eddington that no one in this town has time for. We'll talk about Lodge and his significant importance later. But what I found so rewarding about Eddington is the way that this movie smartly identifies media consumption in this film. And there are different types of media consumption in play in this film of Eddington. We have this mainstream right-wing media. You know these channels. You know the Fox News. You know the Tucker Carlson equivalents. We then have the fringe conspiratorial media. This is your Alex Jones. In this film, it's portrayed as a character named Vernon Peake, played by Austin Butler, who is this seemingly radical cult leader. I don't know if it's supposed to be a direct comparison, but it does feel very Russell Brand stylized. And there is also this performative allyship slash youth culture at play in this movie. And I think this is a lot of people's frustrations with this movie. Essentially, in Eddington, there is this group of teenagers who watch the violence towards Black people throughout the country, specifically the George Floyd murder, and they begin participating in Black Lives Matters protests within the town of Eddington. And you see them parroting talking points. And they're just consistently a running joke throughout this movie where white teenagers consistently reminding everyone of their whiteness and thus lesser voices. There's this really funny line that I wrote down. I'm just another privileged white kid and my job is to sit down and listen. And that's what I plan to do right after this speech, which I have no right to make. It's very direct and people are going to find this extremely annoying, especially if you agree with this ideology. I think what this movie is showing is the performative aspect of allyship in certain groups of people. And this isn't a movie that I think by any means is anti-Black Lives Matter. I think this is more skewering a crowd that thinks behaving a certain way is then representing Black Lives Matter well. That is kind of the point of this. There is this display in this movie that these teenagers are not deeply invested in anything they're talking about. They perform to impress their peers. And in many of the teens' cases in this movie, this is clearly them trying to find their own community and make kinship that way. And for some of them, it's also to impress girls. That is also a very key plot point for some of these characters. And again, I don't think this movie is espousing that it is anti-Black Lives Matter. I don't get that vibe at all. It's rather pointing out to a very specific virtue signaling and an exploitation of a movement like Black Lives Matter as an outlet to fuel narcissism. And because they are so lost in what community looks like anymore, that this is the only way they can find it. And that brings us to the central concept of this movie. And this movie argues that we are all in some way affected by that, this distance that is created via the screen, and then us trying to then connect to the world and then find community. Even in Eddington, reality is so different from that of Cincinnati or Seattle, but it often feels like they're trying to be Cincinnati or Seattle in the way that they talk and approach their local politics. Eddington is so isolated from COVID that it isn't really a big concern. And that's something that the Joe Cross character starts off. He is very clearly anti-masker when we start this character. And his main thing is he just doesn't see the reason of wearing a mask when there's no COVID around and they're so far apart from any other major city in New Mexico that COVID just isn't entering this town. There's all these other specific points that show that this community of Eddington is trying to act and behave like other cities that are more densely populated. For instance, we see protests in these movies for a town that really doesn't have anyone Black in it except for one sheriff, and all the white protesters are trying to tell him how he should feel about George Floyd and his murder, and all the young protesters are white. And I think this is locating something very smart, which is I was 22 during COVID, and I was in college during Trump's first term, all of it. And I recognize you can call it the social justice warrior language from Twitter that makes its way into real life. Now, I do think this movie is overly satirizing it, where I just don't know that many people who talk like this. And I do think that that can be a little disconcerting to people watching this movie, where they're just like, this is such a parody of what somebody thinks a 20-year-old acts like. And I do think that's true. Like, there is times in this movie where I'm like, okay, this is what Bill Maher assumes someone who is 20 thinks and behaves like. There is that real disconnect. I did find the satire to actually work fairly well, because I think he does locate something very interesting, which is this disconnect between online activism versus the real world. And when people are confronted in the real world, they don't really know how to act or say what they have read online. That's such a key to this movie, and that's also kind of what Sheriff Joe Cross, played by Joaquin Phoenix, is trying to kind of come to grips with in this movie. And we need to talk about the Joaquin Phoenix performance at the center of this movie because it's kind of central to understanding Eddington. And again, we meet this character of Joe Cross. We know a few things about him right away. He is an anti-masker. He doesn't believe in mandates and how they apply to rural life. He is a loving husband who seeks connection with his wife, Louise, played by Emma Stone. We start this movie with him watching a video of how to communicate to his wife about wanting children. He is desperately trying to connect with someone that you get a sense has never held him, has never touched him, or takes him seriously at all as a sexual partner. There is this quite literal wall between these two characters that grows more and more apparent as the film goes along. He is somebody that takes his job seriously. He wants to serve his town, and he has a lot of, if not noble ideas, because I do think this character is often very misguided. He is somebody that is trying to treat people with decency and is trying to be nice and understanding to everybody's way of life and their viewpoints. He does have that energy going throughout him. He is also someone deeply, deeply ascribed to conspiracy theory culture. We learned that he is somebody that seemingly believes in, I would guess it would be called Pizzagate, any of these conspiracy theories that somehow connect like celebrity culture to this pedophilia ring in New York and all those weird conspiracy theories that you heard blasted around and still are actively hearing blasted around towards members of the liberals elite. He is also a character that is just very clear, not very bright. He becomes more obviously ignorant as the film progresses. And I want to talk about this performance by Joaquin Phoenix because I think it's actually quite a wonderful performance he gives. I think Phoenix presents this character with a dignity and kindness early on. These traits keep him relatable even as the darker elements emerge. I have no patience for a lot of the stuff that he is spewing in this movie. I don't believe in any of that stuff. But again, there is a general kindness to this character that it does feel that in a certain light, he would be somebody that is kind, that he would be somebody that is helpful. It's just in these specific circumstances, it draws out the worst of him. And I think Phoenix being able to locate that and keep him relatable in this allows for his darker elements to slowly emerge. And that's kind of the magic trick of this movie. This movie takes a far darker pivot towards the second act of this movie, and we are essentially really caught off guard, or I should say at least I was very caught off guard with this tonal change. And it's because we see this character descend, but it's so gradual that it makes it even more disturbing that when this character enters the point of no return, you're just like, oh, wait, what just happened? And then you think about it and you're like, oh, that does make sense. It is a masterclass performance by Joaquin Phoenix to have this much control with this character and keep him at the center and interesting to watch. And this is the point of this movie. This is radicalization via screens because that is essentially how this character of Joe Cross is essentially indoctored into. He is watching tragic content on his phone to fall asleep, whether that's shootings, whether that's videos on trauma or violence. It is this social media algorithm that is feeding him the worst of the worst. And that includes conspiracy theories commenting on these terrible events going on. And it begins to make his mind spiral, already going on with all the issues that he's having in his own personal life. This is a character who is consuming this mindset 24/7 and is kind of experiencing the worst. He is so chronologically online. And you then see it, and it's really clear when he begins creating content of his own, you see that narcissism come forth, but it's well-meaning. That's kind of the point. Like when he first makes a video, you see him like when he's talking about this character of Ted Garcia, played by Pedro Pascal, like he is seeing himself as an opportunity against Ted Garcia and some of the hypocrisy Ted Garcia stands for, but he is again trying to do it in what he believes to be the best interest of the town. And it doesn't feel as specifically hated towards this character of Ted Garcia. As the film goes along, you see this hatred and disdain really grow, and you see the character of Joe Cross start making baseless accusations and going on social media. And really, you see this character radicalized through this. And it's social media, it's isolation, it's ego. This all radicalizes him, as well as the fact that his family life is collapsing as we see it in this movie. And that's where this Emma Stone character comes in place. And I'm really avoiding spoilers, which I'll get to in a second, but let's talk about this Emma Stone character of Louise, who plays the wife of Joaquin Phoenix character in this. And what we see in this character is a performance devoid of charisma, and that's purposeful. This is not a bad performance by Emma Stone at all. This is a character that is supposed to be deeply traumatized when we meet her, and it's to the point of complete isolation and inability to function. And that also leads her psyche to kind of get destroyed when she is consistently consuming online behavior that further isolates her, until she eventually finds a community, and she finds this community that basically is preying on mentally unwell people. That's where we get this Austin Butler storyline and experience in this film. I will just say Austin Butler is masterfully deployed in this movie. He has this locked on intensity as an actor that really gives him this charisma that also makes him quite frightening and off-putting. But you also see why somebody would be enamored by the spell of him. And that's where this character of Joaquin Phoenix just starts to spiral. When all of these components are coming forth in his life, along with all of the cultural stuff being brought into Eddington and all of that baggage, it really makes this character snap. And it makes this character just become something more deviant than I think we had seen at any other point. And I want to address, before I get into spoilers, there is this part that is really important with Eddington. And I hear a lot of people criticizing this movie for calling it playing on both sides, which is, you can label it any other way. You can label it as centrist BS. You can label this movie as anti-BLM. You can label this movie as pro-Trump. You can label this movie saying that both sides are bad, and that is nonsense. I would argue all of these complaints are bad faith readings of this movie. And again, I already argued, I don't think this is a liberal or conservative movie. It's a cynical movie for sure, but it is a movie exploring how we fight, why we fight, and who we ignore and abandon in the process. And one last thing I want to just say about this before we jump into spoilers is, even if you do believe that this movie is straddling the fence in some way, that it is playing both sides, and I think Ari Aster described this very well, is one side is kind of annoying and the other side is extremely violent and conspiratorial and causes so much destruction and mayhem in this path, because this movie does take a rather dark turn, and the turn is sudden and frightening. That's when I'm talking about this thing of both sides. It's like they're not really comparable. One you might be annoyed by, the other one is actually quite literally so dangerous. So before I jump into spoilers, I just want to say to everyone who doesn't want to hear spoilers, I'll just say, I do think this movie has a messy ending that is overly long, and that's what we'll get to in the spoilers section. But I would recommend you check out this movie. This is a movie that's grown on me the more I've thought about it in the past 24 hours. I've really loved diving deep into this movie. This is a recommendation for me. 4 stars. Now, to everyone who is staying for our spoiler section, let's talk spoilers and what the meat and potatoes of this movie is and what people's real complaints are, because this movie takes a deep dive in the second half. And it's key with this character of Lodge, played by Clifton Collins Jr., who is a homeless man ignored by every political side in this movie. He is afflicted with a mental illness and he needs intervention and help. And eventually this leads to him being killed by Joe Cross in a bar, where Joe disposes of the body and gets away with it. And this marks Joe's descent into full violence, and when this movie takes a far more radical, dangerous, scary turn. And then we're along the way, this is all caused by the Luis and Vernon Peake subplot. These are the Emma Stone and Austin Butler characters. Essentially, the scene that happens right before Joe shoots Lodge is we see Louise has PTSD from her childhood trauma, and she grows distant from Joe. That eventually leads her to running away with Vernon Peake and this conservative cult, which leaves this character of Joe fully isolated. And this is the final breaking point. And that's when he kills Lodge. And this brings us into Joe's final act in this movie. And like I said, and this is a very key quote that Ari Aster said that I kind of parroted a few minutes ago, but in his Vulture interview, Ari Aster said, "I heard one person say it was harder on the left than the right, and I think that's pretty disingenuous. In this film, one side is kind of annoying and frustrating and hypocritical, and the other side is killing people and destroying lives." And that is a huge point of this movie, because we see the character of Joe Cross start just actively lying about the Ted Garcia, which becomes a really big plot point in this movie, which is Joe Cross falsely accuses Ted Garcia of abusing his wife, Louise, played by Emma Stone, which is a false accusation, according to Louise. And he is trying to destroy his reputation. And what eventually leads to it is this confrontation. The reason I did not talk about Pedro Pascal a lot in the non-spoiler section is because his role is actually very much a supporting one. He is only in the real first hour of this film, and his role disappears because he gets killed. He is the inciting incident of this movie. He is killed when Joe decides to shoot him, and he murders Ted and his son, and he frames his black officer for the crime. Like, this is the inciting incident that kickstarts the third act of this movie. And despite this, where this movie ends, we leave Joe as becoming a folk hero, whatever that means. And this is where the movie starts to reinvent the Western and its comparisons. This is, and I didn't want to say this in the non-spoiler section because I think it gives away this plot point of Joe. This is a modern Western meets Taxi Driver. This is the gradual radicalization and the turn to shocking, irreversible violence. And the Pedro Pascal character in Garcia, here's what we know about this guy. And I think it's why Pascal works very well in this movie. He is charismatic. You can also tell that this character is probably corrupt. And he's ultimately murdered by law enforcement, and he becomes another person of color victim. There is slimy things about the character that Pascal plays. That's why the Pascal character works, because he does give this really good antagonism to this movie, to the Joe Cross character, to the way that he seems so put off and so annoyed to be a public servant to people. And yet the inciting incident leads to him being killed. And then this leads to everything else and the film breaking into chaos, which is the third act of this movie, which people are going to have a lot of issues with, especially the way this movie fundamentally shifts perspectives. And that is in the third act, as Joe basically starts his killing spree, we are then introduced to these inciting agents, and they're labeled as Antifa. And what we quickly begin to learn is it seems that they are privatized. They are a privatized company hired most likely by this tech company trying to buy land on Eddington, that the Ted Garcia character is like helping them with this business transaction to happen and make this town friendly for tech companies. And gun violence erupts in this town of Eddington. And the key of this is that it doesn't matter who's in charge, big tech controls everything. And the big part of this movie that I think is kind of something that Ari Aster has done very well with all four of his movies, they are all conspiratorial movies, but the conspiracy is not hidden within them. They are all very apparent. This movie does feel like it is consistently has this character of Joe Cross surrounded. And I think that's an effect that all of Ari Aster's movies do very well. Sometimes they're very fully realized, like in Beau is Afraid, which is a movie about the id and the superego, where in other films it's also just quite literally apparent in like Midsommar, where the forces, when you arrive to Midsommar, you're like, oh, this place probably isn't good and is going to spell trouble. But that leads us to the ending outcomes of this movie, which is the teenage protester of this movie. And I know I'm kind of going fast. I figured anyone who's watching this movie is able to follow along. But we end this movie with a teenage protester that we've seen throughout this movie. He is the same one that is lecturing his parents on his whiteness. And we also know that he owns a lot of guns and that this family is armed to the teeth. And eventually it leads to him killing the inciting agent and becoming a folk hero on the right. This character quite literally transforms into something of a Kyle Rittenhouse-like figure. And you see him praised by Marjorie Taylor Greene type figures on this side. Like so literally that we see Marjorie Taylor Greene with this character. And it is supposed to kind of show the upsetting nature of all this. And again, the right-wing radicalization and violence in display within this movie. And then we leave this character of Joe, who his fate is he's left paralyzed, mute, trapped in a wheelchair, basically damned to his screen for the rest of eternity, where he is forced to just sit in his wheelchair and watch the screen for the rest of his life. And this is something that is very much a reoccurring theme for Ari Aster. Every movie ends with the character in a state of paralysis / frozen in their physical body. That's Beau is Afraid. That's Hereditary. That is Midsommar. The way that this movie does this is very, I found, smartly done and well rewarded. And that's why I wanted to talk about this movie in such depth, because when I heard criticisms that this movie is both sides or anything like that, I just find it to be completely misguided, and that's not the point of this movie. I hope this helps explain what Eddington is and what this movie is trying to be as I understand it. I'm sure there is far more that I've missed on it, but I think this is a pretty good summation of this movie. So thank you to everyone who watched this really long review of Eddington. I hope if you're still watching that you're subscribed to this channel. Give me a shout out, leave a comment in my comment section letting me know what you thought about this movie. I'm sure a lot of you hated it. I hope I've at least provided clarity to this movie. And thank you to everyone who watched. I'll be back next week. I'll be having reviews out for another A24 movie, Sorry Baby. I'll have reviews for Fantastic Four. I have a few Criterion reviews that I'm going to be doing. And I will be having a review for the horror film Together that I'm very excited that I'll be seeing Wednesday. So thank you to everyone watching. I hope you subscribe and take care. Bye-bye.